In many ways, preparedness and survival and self-reliance in the modern day are revolutionary acts. Because in a world in which the perfect citizen is one who is the most reliant and the most embedded and enmeshed in the grid, the prepper of the survivalist then, by definition, is diametrically opposed and possibly even could be construed by that system as an enemy of that system. Now, as far as I can see, the model citizen is one who is the most enmeshed in the grid as they can possibly be. The model citizen is somebody who relies for their personal security on the state. They rely for their own personal self-defense on the police. Basically, the extent of their emergency self-defense plan is how fast can they call 911. So the modern citizen is somebody who's imaginatively stunted. And this is a result of the overwhelming amount of media and the lack of our need to basically use our imaginations nowadays. As our virtual and our audiovisual experiences become more immersive, now we no longer need to rely on our minds, our abilities to imagine something happening and entertain ourselves in that way. Now we are amused by other people's creations. So kids nowadays, instead of having to imagine something happening in their mind, basically it's happening on the screen for them. And this is going to have the effect of making us perpetually less analytical and less critical of our surroundings as we go forth into the future, into the virtual reality age which is upon us. Now, I know it's sounding like I'm very jaded and cynical about the state of things, and in some cases I am. However, I am willing to entertain the idea that perhaps, this is the way things are supposed to go. Perhaps we are supposed to be stripped of our individuality and freedom in order for the global hive mind to blossom and mature. Now, that obviously is not my preferred perspective, but as a rational thinker, I have to entertain that notion. That said, let's get back to being cynical for a second. Now, the model citizen is somebody who is indiscernible for the system. They're somebody who, loves sports. They basically do what everybody else is doing. They make sure their grass is a certain height, is a certain tone of green that everybody else on their street has. They make sure that their car is nice and clean. They make sure they do anything in order to blend in and not stand out and possibly be looked down on by the droves of shallow and mindless drones who might criticize them for not being perfectly symmetrical and in line with everybody else. The model citizen is a person who gets straight A's not for their ability to think creatively, to think defiantly, or go against the grain of things as they are today, but as a person who can remember things well and basically provide the responses that the teacher wants to hear. Just like how a computer can function, every code that's written in to create the illusion that's on your screen right now has to be programmed to a T, and that is the model citizen in relation to the global hive mind. They're a person who is perfectly encoded into the grid. Whereas the self-reliant type, or the prepper, is somebody who is antithetical to all of that. Now, the core philosophy of prepping is being self-reliant. In many ways, preparedness, survivalism, self-reliance is born of a fear that's rooted in our distrust of the grid as a whole. And a lot of that is sort of an evolutionary throwback, because we understand that, we're only 9 meals from anarchy. We're only a stone's throw away from being reliant on somebody. And instead of having blind faith in the system at all ends, we instead decide to take matters into our own hands, take responsibility for our own lives in those situations that perhaps other people's creative capacity will not allow them to see. Because in a world in which the perfect citizen is one who is the most reliant and the most embedded and enmeshed in the grid, and is indiscernible from the grid, has no unique thoughts of their own, or has very few unique thoughts of their own. The prepper of the survivalist then, by definition, is diametrically opposed and possibly even could be construed by that system as an enemy of that system. So indeed, once you cross that line into wanting to be more self-reliant, whether it's a conscious decision or whether you even label yourself a prepper or survivalist or what have you, a self-reliant type, a homesteader, it doesn't matter. Right when you cross that line into wanting to have more control over what goes on, because there's a trade-off, the more control you have, the less control the system has. Once you cross that line into having a desire to control your destiny in some way, shape, or form, you basically become a drag on that system, or at least you're not contributing to it to the full effect that you possibly could. And you're further from being a model citizen than you perhaps once were. Now, indeed, there is an aspect of preparedness which is commodified. So there's a commercial aspect to all of this, but I think that's only a stage. I call that level 1 prepping. It's really the stage which precedes being that of a micro prepper. If you haven't seen my micro, meso, macro prepping video, go check that out. But basically, maybe we could call this like the Bear Grylls phase. So this is the phase in which you buy the Bear Grylls tools, the knives, and all that stuff. And that's pretty much where it ends. You watch a few episodes of The Walking Dead, makes you think that there's going to be some sort of zombie apocalypse. You go, you buy some Bear Grylls stuff. That's the end of it. You move on to the next fad, Game of Thrones, or whatever the hell there is out there nowadays to keep people amused. So in order to move to level 2 type prepping and really cross that line to a point where you're no longer just a part of the scheme that is the commercialization of preparedness, you really have to have some sort of natural inclination to distrust authority on some level. You have to have a healthy set of instincts in a way, just perhaps a sixth sense for the fact that maybe it's about human nature, maybe you have a deeper understanding of it on some visceral level. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are or how many words you have in your vocabulary. Anybody can have that sense, that natural sense. And that's why you see preppers and self-reliant types from across the spectrum in terms of their intellectual capacity. So with these Bear Grylls or Yellow Zone preppers, this is kind of the people who groups like FEMA might target. So FEMA will say, put out your 72-hour kit, and they'll encourage people to do that much. But at the end of the day, you've got to remember FEMA is a government-run organization, and they're regulators, or the regulated, depending on how you want to see it. But, they'll encourage you to go and get the pre-made bug-out bags, to get enough just so you can last a little while, but in no way be self-reliant. So they're going to encourage you to still, pay your taxes. Nowadays, they're even regulating fireplaces in Canada. They're basically going to phase that out pretty soon, where you can't have a fireplace in your home without all of these hoops that you have to jump through. You can't collect rainwater to use it. All the food is regulated. You can't trade certain goods without it being regulated. You can't hunt, you can't defend yourself. But what you can get is a lot of medication for all the problems that you might incur living this pseudo-satisfied, consumption-driven life. They will give you as much medication as you need to stay productive. They'll give you energy drinks, whatever you need just to stay productive and keep the machine humming as a whole. They won't tell you to eat healthy. In fact, they'll make it very challenging for you to eat healthy because, of course, all the localized markets now have been trumped by the global transport grid, so it's far more cost effective to get genetically modified stuff from 3,000 miles away than it is to get it from somebody in your own neighborhood who could perhaps grow it and can it themselves. Now, I understand what some of the criticisms are going to be to this long-winded rant, that yes, indeed, we are not just individuals, we are a species. We're destined perhaps to do greater things, and the only way we can do that is to perhaps unify on some level and standardize and make the matters which we deal with each other universal, so that we might evolve in a more sophisticated, specialized way, that we might traverse the cosmos and do all that fun stuff 3,000 years from now. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that the forces that might be driving this push towards hyper-regulation of everything in our lives might not be as ethical as we'd like to believe that it is. And I just want to remind everybody, as we go forth into this brave new world, and indeed, every day that goes by now, we're going deeper and deeper into the global hive mind. And as we venture forth into it, I want you to remember that the survivalist and self-reliant tendencies that you have are diametrically opposed to the system in which you are in. Just keep that in mind when you're moving forward. I don't mean that to scare you in a sense. It's just a reality that you're going to have to endure. There are people who are doing very good work, like the urban prepper for one, who makes preparedness less crazy seeming, for lack of a better term. He makes it seem very practical and appealing to the average person, and in many ways that's a gateway into being self-reliant. The urban prepper is probably one of the most valuable people in the preparedness community, because he's not speaking to things from a political standpoint. It's a neutral standpoint, and that right there invites people in who probably would not normally want to hear any of this stuff, because they associate it with, nuttiness and all that, so they don't want to get into it. He brings people like that into the discussion and lets them see that there is some sensibility to being reliant on yourself and a reason to do so, and it all starts there. But remember, at its core, the prepping and survival philosophy is one of intellectual deviancy. It's something that essentially goes against the core direction, or the zeitgeist, if you will, of our global system, which is one of hyperregulation, uniformity, conformity, moving in one direction. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I look forward to hearing this one. I'm sure I did rock the boat a little bit with some people here, so I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.